Welcome. Good evening. How are you? Good. My name is Kalima Salahuddin. I'm your moderator today. I'm on the board of the Jefferson Union High School District. I'm the chair of Housing Leadership, and I am also the co-founder of the REACH Coalition, and I get very little sleep. But I am here because this issue is very important to me as someone who is a person of color, who has lived in this county the majority of their life and has raised kids in this county, who wants their kids to be able to live in this county and not have to have the struggle that I have. I'm happy that you guys are all here today to hear this important information. So I suspect that many of you were present in 2019 when Richard Rothstein spoke in this very same sanctuary to the standing room only audience of nearly 400. He shared the disturbing history documented in his highly influential book, The Color of Law. That book was also one of the revelations to me where people walked up to me and said, "Did you know that racism was a thing in San Mateo County?" And I was like, yes. He described how government, in all levels, national, state, and local, has segregated communities in this country and worked to prevent all but whites from owning homes. While I think most of us came away from his presentation feeling very enlightened by his remarks, many of us were also left with an urgent desire to learn about what we can do. Tonight, Mr. Rothstein returns to San Mateo, this time with his daughter, Leah, to help answer this question. The two of them have recently co-authored a new book released in June that explores this subject. It's called Just Action: Challenging the Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. Also, that is the title of tonight's event. To prepare for writing this book, they did a survey of cities and towns all across the country to learn what concerned community members were doing to build more inclusive communities and reverse the injustices of our exclusionary past. Tonight, we will hear what their research has revealed. So, before we get into that, I would like to just do a little housekeeping. First, the bathrooms. They are through the back doors, down the left, then turn left again, and you'll see them in the hallway. Second, questions. When you signed in this evening, you were provided with an index card. I'm supposed to hold up the card, but I wasn't given one, but hopefully you have the cards. Yes. If you have a question you would like to ask, please wait to the Q&A period, write them on the card, and pass the card to the person at the far end of the aisle away from the center. Moderator points to this area. And at 7:45, the ushers will come by and pick them up. Is that all clear? Great. Now I would like to call to the podium our speakers. I'm sorry, no I won't, I'm sorry. I would like to call to the podium Alexis Lewis, a community activist. I know, a community activist and a member of the San Mateo chapter of the NAACP. Alexis has the privilege of introducing our speakers. Thank you, Alexis.
Thank you, Kalima. Indeed, it is a privilege to introduce our featured speakers who have researched and written thought-provoking writings that continue to open the eyes and hearts of many. They also encourage us all to do progressive community activism, and I'm glad that I am an activist here in San Mateo County. Richard Rothstein is the author of the acclaimed book entitled The Color of Law, which was a New York Times bestseller and one of the 10 finalists for the National Book Award in 2017. He is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He has written extensively on both education and race. Leah, Richard's daughter, is an expert in housing policy, and she's worked with public policy from grassroots to the halls of government. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms. Her policy work is informed by her years as a community organizer with Pueblo and California for Justice, and also as a labor organizer. Let's welcome Richard and Leah Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Alexis. And thanks to all of you for inviting me here again. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I know that unlike most of the audiences we speak to, many of you have read The Color of Law, so I'm going to be much briefer than usual in summarizing it before we begin to talk about just action, which is the reason we're here this evening. The Color of Law, published in 2017, demolished the myth of de facto segregation, the idea that the reason that we are really an apartheid society, separate communities, mostly white, separate communities, mostly African American, de facto segregation, the idea that that all happened by accident because of private discrimination or businesses, developers, banks, insurance companies discriminating, or maybe because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe it's all because of income differences. All of these individual, bigoted, discriminatory reasons, self-choice is what created segregation, and we told ourselves that what's happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. Most of us don't like the fact that we live in such a segregated society. We think it's too bad, but we don't feel any obligation to do anything about it. Well, what the Color of Law demonstrated is that that's nonsense. We don't have de facto segregation in this country. The reason we have segregated communities is because of racially explicit public policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to ensure that African Americans in particular and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. It was a racially explicit program, unconstitutional, violation of our Constitution and of our laws, but the federal government and state and local governments went ahead and did it anyway. Well, I'm going to give you just one brief example to refresh your memory a little bit, because it applies to this area as well of the South Bay. In the post-World War II period, the federal government, through the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations, designed a program to move the entire white population out of urban areas like San Francisco into single-family homes in suburban areas, so many of which exist in this area. Only whites were the subject of this program. African Americans were denied the opportunity to participate. I've written much about it even in this area, but the one I talked about in The Color of Law, and perhaps the most famous one nationwide, is a place called Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. There are many of them like this in California as well, and here in Northern California. The developer, William Levitt, of course, he was a bigot. If left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold homes to African Americans. But he wasn't left to his own devices. No bank would lend him the money to build such a project. No bank would lend money to the builders of projects here in Northern California. They thought it was a crazy idea. We weren't a suburban country at that time. Most people were living in urban areas, whites and blacks, working class, middle class families, all living in urban areas, because we were a manufacturing economy. Factories needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So the workers in those factories, the employees of the banks and the insurance companies that service those factories, all were living in downtown areas. The federal government wanted to move the whites out of those areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs, and prohibit African Americans from doing so. Levittown, those 17,000 homes, Levitt went to the federal government, submitted his plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets. Same thing was true here in Northern California. And a required commitment, required by the federal government, that he never sell a home to an African American. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration. It was written federal policy The federal government had a manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the application of builders to build suburban developments. The manual said you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that would be all white if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said, and we all believe we have de facto segregation, an other myth. Well, Levittown went ahead, Daly City went ahead, all of the, on the other side of the bay, Richmond and outside of Richmond, Milpitas, all of these communities were developed with FHA financing for whites only. They were inexpensive homes. When they were built in the mid-20th century, they cost about $9,000, $10,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Any working family with a job in the post-war economy, and both African Americans and whites had those jobs, could afford a home at that price. But African Americans were prohibited from buying them. Whites were subsidized with FHA mortgages and VA mortgages. VA mortgages required a no down payment. FA mortgages had a lower interest rate. Whites were subsidized to buy those homes. I begin The Color of Law, some of you may remember, talking about a Ford motor plant in Richmond that moved to Milpitas. The white workers could follow it and live in Milpitas. The black workers could not. Well, as you know, homes like those, $100,000 homes all over the country, no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for various parts of the country, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In this area, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes, they didn't buy them intending to be rich. They needed a place to live. They didn't expect the homes to appreciate in value that way, but they did. And the families who bought those homes gained wealth from the appreciation of the value of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, unemployment, or maybe a medical situation. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from accumulating that wealth through that program. The result is that today, although African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, that's a disparity. It's not one we have time to go into this evening, but you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio between African Americans and whites on average, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American households have incomes that average about 60% of white households, African American wealth in this country is about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. Unconstitutional, meaning we as Americans have an obligation, not just an interest, but an obligation to do something to fix it. Well, that wealth gap not only throughout the country consigns African Americans to less well-resourced neighborhoods, to less expensive homes, to places closer to industrial facilities, to and more pollution, to schools that are overwhelmed with the social and economic problems of their pupils and have difficulty overcoming those. The wealth gap underlies all of the most serious social problems in this country and our political divisions. I mean, how can we ever expect, I mean, this is a frightening time even to talk about this. How can we ever expect to have a common national identity if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other? That we have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other's life experiences. It's very difficult to conceive how that could happen. Well, After I wrote the book and I went around the country giving talks at places like this, actually I've been here to the Congregational Church of San Mateo more than I have anywhere else. I love coming back here. It's the most, it's just about the most welcoming place I've ever been. But still, people asked me, what can we do about it? I didn't know what we could do about it entirely. One thing I was convinced of was that there is no political will in this country at this point to address this inequality at a federal level. But once you have two populations, two groups of people who are living in different circumstances, state and local policies will reinforce and exacerbate that segregation, their differences, their disadvantages, one over the other. And so there's an enormous opportunity that we have to begin to address this segregation at a local level. I didn't know what all those policies might be, what all those programs might be, what all those actions that we might take could be. So I recruited one of the most impressive housing experts in the country to help me co-author a new book to help explain to people what they can do to challenge the segregation that was enacted under the color of law. The book is called Just Action. My daughter Leah co-authored it with me, and I'm going to turn it over to her for a few minutes to talk about some of the ways that we can actually move forward to fix it.
All right. All right, good evening. Thank you so much for having us tonight. So I'll pick up where my dad left off with this obligation we have to do something to redress and challenge and remedy segregation, the obligation that comes from our government taking unconstitutional actions to create the segregated society we live in. So how do we live up to that obligation? Well, what we argue in Just Action is that for all of us to live up to that obligation nationally, we need to start reinvigorate a reactivated civil rights movement around the country, beginning, yeah, thank you. And we need to do that by forming groups locally that can take on local issues, because like my dad said, once segregation was established by the federal government, to a large extent, it's sustained and perpetuated by local policy. So local groups organized to redress segregation in their own communities can start to build the national reinvigorated civil rights movement that can begin to make substantial change around the country and eventually, hopefully, bubble up to federal policy change. Well, it might seem like we're on our way to building that new reinvigorated civil rights movement after the racial reckoning of 2020 following George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. There were 20 million people around the country who marched in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. It's a lot of people. That's more people than have ever marched in racial justice actions or demonstrations in this country's history. They were Black and white and Hispanic, Asian. They were young and old, from urban, suburban, rural communities. It seemed like there was a lot of energy around this issue. Well, then many of those 20 million people, they went home, dealt with COVID. They put up lawn signs on their front lawns, or they started book groups and educated themselves, or they went back to their companies where their companies hired diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, and maybe issued letters to their shareholders saying, denouncing racism and promising to do better. I'm not saying any of those things are bad things. They're all necessary to sort of advance the conversation throughout our communities and our country. They're necessary to build awareness, but those actions, lawn signs, book clubs, letters to shareholders, those alone won't create the substantial, the significant change we need on the local level to change the causes and consequences of segregation and actually impact people's lives. So how do we get from those actions from those more performative actions to actions that actually have significant impacts? Well, we can start by forming biracial, multi-ethnic groups in our own communities that are educated and activated and ready to take on these issues. Now, we understand we live in a segregated society, so many of us live in racially homogenous communities. We don't necessarily have natural social contact with people of other races. Going to the grocery store, dropping our kids off at school, we run into people who look like us for the most part, outside of the workplace. And so it takes some intentional effort and some sort of intentional steps to bring people of different races together to start to work on these issues. So in Just Action, we give a few examples of communities that have taken those intentional steps to build cross-race relationships, some social capital and social networks, learn that we actually have a lot in common and that we have these shared desires to change what our communities look like, and then can use those social connections and social networks to advocate for change on the local level. So often those groups can start by, like has happened around here, is start by learning about the history of how your region or community or area has come to be segregated. Looking into the restrictive covenants, for example, in several communities that we write about in Just Action, these efforts started when homeowners discovered a restrictive covenant on the deed of their own home. And those restrictive covenants, again, were a primary tool of the federal government in creating segregated communities. They are written into the deeds of a home that say the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. They have various language, but that's generally the gist of them. They're no longer legally enforceable, but they remain on the deeds forever because they're part of the legal documentation for that property. So homeowners have discovered these on the deeds of their own homes and been shocked to see how intentionally their own community in their own home was segregated. This often then has led people to start volunteer-led efforts to inventory all of the restrictive covenants and show, where they exist and overlay them with the maps with the racial makeup of their community, and then can educate their neighbors about how their community came to be segregated. Because again, once we can get out of this idea that it happened by accident, and once we can start to see written in plain text on these restrictive covenants that intentional actions created the segregation of our communities, we can start to see that intentional action can begin to undo it. So that's often an initial first step that groups start with and then lead them to action. And what kinds of actions can they take? Well, we discuss in Just Action dozens of strategies and policies that local groups can take on to begin to undo and dismantle all of the systems that sustain and maintain segregation. And when we talk about all of these strategies, we talk about them they do two things. One is they look to the future to ensure that we don't continue to create and maintain segregated communities. So we have to change the policies that are in place that sustain and perpetuate segregation already. And then we also have to look to the past and address the disparities, like the wealth gap that my dad talked about, that exist as a consequence of our segregated society. And we can't truly redress and challenge and remedy the causes and consequences of segregation until we do, or unless we do both things. So both are necessary, have to sort of happen at the same time. And then, so those strategies that do both of those things, they generally fit into two main categories. The first category that we talk about are called, in sort of policy wonky language, place-based strategies. And those are strategies that are concerned with increasing investments and resources in underserved, lower-resourced, segregated African-American communities. These are communities where the concentration of poverty is another consequence of its segregation. And so if we want to remedy the segregation of that community, we want to make those areas of higher opportunity, of greater resource, more banks, more bank branches, more grocery stores, open space, cleaner air, more housing options, well-maintained homes without lead paint. These are called the higher opportunity communities. Now, we also understand that often when this happens in a lower income neighborhood, when investments and resources increase, that people with higher incomes want to move in. They're often whiter people want to move in, and they price out the long-term residents of those areas, and gentrification happens, and a lot of the longtime residents of those communities are displaced. So we want to couple those strategies that are concerned with increasing investment with strategies that are concerned with preventing some of the displacement that can occur when that happens. So some of the things we can do to prevent displacement are passing just cause eviction ordinances. I know that's being talked about here. It's extremely important to ensure that tenants can't be evicted for any old reason. It has to be a just cause, like failure to pay rent or massive property damage. So we want to protect tenants from being kicked out of their homes. We can also do that through right to counsel programs, where lower income tenants have access or free right to an attorney to represent them in an eviction proceeding. Oftentimes, lower income tenants who are facing an eviction, they don't have legal representation, they don't know sort of what they can do to help their case, and so they often don't show up to their hearings. And even if they do, there's not much they can do. The judges rubber stamp their evictions. Lawyers often show up with representation. The tenants sort of have no recourse. So we describe in Just Action a program in Cleveland that was a partnership with the Legal Aid Society there and the United Way that worked together to provide free representation to every low-income tenant facing an eviction and helped ensure that the tenants knew about that right and could access and find their attorney. And it went a long way. I think 90% of the tenants that they represented avoided an eviction on their record and stayed in their home if they wanted to. So these are important anti-displacement efforts and things that can be enacted locally and started and funded through local efforts. Another strategy that does both of these things, increase investments and prevent some displacement, is a community land trust. And I understand we'll hear more about that after we talk tonight. But so I think there's one starting here now. Community land trusts exist in over 300 communities around the country. They're an excellent model for creating permanently affordable home ownership opportunities and also preventing some displacement that can occur in communities where housing prices are rising rapidly. So in Just Action, we describe the Durham Community Land Trust in Durham, North Carolina. It was started in a lower income, predominantly African American community neighborhood in Durham near Duke University. And the neighbors there started just organizing by talking to each other about what they could do to improve conditions in their neighborhood to make things better. And the first thing they all decided that they wanted to work on was to get the city to turn a vacant lot in their neighborhood into a park, because there were no parks and kids played in the street and it was dangerous. And they agreed that that's what they wanted to work on first. So they did, and they advocated for that with the city, and they won, and they got their park, and that galvanized the group and made them think, oh, well, what else could we do, around here? And so they started to think about it and talk about it and realized their neighborhood was gentrifying because Duke was expanding enrollment and investors were buying up properties to rent or sell to the Duke University community, and people were being displaced from this neighborhood. And so this group learned about the land trust model, and they started one with 2 vacant homes that the city donated to the land trust. That's how it started. They fixed up the homes and sold them at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. At the time, they sold them in today's money for $100,000, again, an affordable price for a home. And the way a land trust can sell homes for an affordable price is that in the sale, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house and just sells the home. Now, one of the reasons housing prices are rising so quickly is because land prices rise very quickly. So when you take the land out of the equation, the home is more affordable. And then the homeowners, they own that land trust home. Like any other homeowner, they ground lease the land from the land trust for something negligible, maybe $1 a year. And then they own their home, they pay their taxes and insurance and mortgage. And then when they want to resell the home, they want to move on for whatever reason, they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that the land trust sets. And every land trust sets it slightly differently, a formula usually. And that maximum resale price has 2 goals, usually. One is to allow the home seller to earn some equity in the sale of the home. It's a limited equity arrangement, so they don't earn as much as if they could sell that home at market rates. But in return, the next home buyer gets an affordable price on that home. So this is how a land trust can create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities, which is a fantastic thing, especially in neighborhoods where housing prices are rising really quickly. So in this neighborhood, in Durham, the Durham Land Trust now has 300 properties around the city. They have for sale and rental properties. Their for sale homes now sell for $150,000, so we can see how that formula ticked up the price a little bit, so they're slightly less affordable. But the homes in the surrounding neighborhood sell for $500,000, so far more affordable than the market rate homes in that area. In the blocks where the Durham Land Trust acquired homes before the investors did, most of the residents are still African American. And in the blocks where the investors outpace the land trusts, those blocks have mostly gentrified and most of the residents are now white. So we can see how the land trust model is really effective at not only creating permanently affordable home ownership opportunities, but also preventing displacement in areas with rapidly increasing housing prices. So what can we do with this example here? Well, I think we'll hear about that soon, about how to support the growing land trust here. And some ways we can support our local land trust are not only personally, with our own time and resources, but collectively, we can advocate that our local government support the land trust by donating vacant land to turn into permanently affordable homes. Now, local governments all over the country in every type of community are sitting on a lot of vacant land. They might be foreclosed homes or unused properties. I know there was a new school site that will become teacher housing. So that's an example of a local government, local school district with vacant land that can be used for something like a land trust. And a part of that land could be donated to a land trust to create these homes. Another thing we can do to support land trusts expanding in our communities is looking at and advocating that the institutions and companies in our communities that supported the creation and maintenance of segregation support remedies for that segregation. So going back to those restrictive covenants I talked about that are on the deeds of homes, also often on the deeds are listed the companies involved with building and first selling that home when it was sold on a restrictive basis. So the deed might list the realtor that first sold the home, the developer or builder, the bank that first financed it. Oftentimes, more often than you would think, these companies are still in business in our communities, even though the home was built decades ago. And if those companies aren't still in business, they've often been acquired by another company that is in business. So we can find those by looking at the restrictive covenants and looking at business records, and go to those businesses as an organized group of residents and advocate that they contribute to remedies for the segregation that they helped to create. And one of those remedies could be supporting a land trust. So that's an example of a strategy that increases investments in lower income communities and prevents some displacement that can occur. The other category of examples of strategies that we talk about are what are called mobility strategies. And those are strategies that are concerned with opening up exclusive, expensive, usually predominantly white communities to diverse residents. We can do this in many ways. Changing zoning, for example, ensuring that communities allow something other than large single-family homes in their midst. So providing in suburban, in expensive, exclusive communities, ensuring that those communities can also produce a range of housing sizes, a range of housing types that have a range of prices, so that the community is more accessible to people with a range of incomes. Now, we argue that that's a necessary first step, but that won't alone create the desegregation of those communities without some intentional preferences or priorities put on the new units that are built under that rezoning to ensure that people who've historically been excluded from those communities, specifically African Americans, have access to buy those homes or rent those homes when they're built. Other things we can do to open up these communities is providing down payment assistance to home buyers, African American home buyers who lack the intergenerational wealth for down payment to buy into these expensive communities, and rental subsidies as well. So I'll go into that example for a few minutes. Excuse me. So the largest rental subsidy program in the country is the Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher Program. It's funded by the federal government through HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it's run by local public housing authorities. So the program is very underfunded. Only about 1/4 of lower income families who are eligible for Section 8 get a Section 8 voucher. That's a whole other issue. But there's 2 million low-income families and households who receive this benefit from the government. So that's a lot of people. They're disproportionately African-American families. And what happens when you receive a Section 8 or Housing Choice voucher is you receive a benefit, a voucher, to help you rent a unit in the private market anywhere in the jurisdiction of your local housing authority. So it's unlike when you receive a benefit to live in public housing, where that benefit comes tied to a place or a unit. With a voucher, you can use it to rent anywhere in the private market. Now, we all want to live in neighborhoods that we call high opportunity neighborhoods with low crime and well-resourced public schools and access to open space and clean air. And the Section 8 program, when it was designed and established, it had the potential and the intention to allow low-income tenants the ability to move to these high-opportunity areas, the ability to move out of high-poverty neighborhoods to rent in the private market in a more well-resourced neighborhood. But only 5% of Section 8 voucher holders can use their voucher to rent in these types of neighborhoods. 5% is a very low number. It's clearly not living up to its potential. White voucher holders are more likely to be able to rent a unit in a high opportunity neighborhood than African American voucher holders. One reason for this is just discrimination, plain and simple. So discrimination against tenants who use Section 8 to help pay their rent is a allowed form of discrimination by the federal government. It's not a protected class on the federal level. It is in the state of California, so California and about 20 other states and about 100 cities and counties have laws called source of income discrimination ordinances that prohibit discrimination against tenants based on how they pay their rent. So if they have a Section 8 voucher, that's a source of their income, they can't outright refuse to rent to people who use Section 8 to help pay their rent. Now, it's great that we have that law in California, but that doesn't mean that discrimination just magically stops. So anytime we pass a law to outlaw discrimination, we have to ensure that we have monitoring and enforcement of that law. So that kind of work, it usually falls to local fair housing organizations or local civil rights organizations. And those organizations need our support to ensure that they can continue to do this monitoring and enforcement, not only educating landlords and tenants that it's illegal to discriminate against voucher holders, but then also finding out where that discrimination is happening and prosecuting them to the extent that it's allowed. So the only way to really know where discrimination is occurring is to do what is called paired testing. And that's when you send two prospective tenants to try to rent a unit. One is African American, one is white. One might say they use Section 8 and one not. Otherwise, they're similar tenants with similar qualifications. And you can see how they're treated by the landlord. One might be told the unit's already been rented, and one might be shown the unit or offered it. And this is how the only way we can truly see where discrimination is occurring. So fair housing centers do this paired testing, but fair housing centers are underfunded. They need more funding. So another thing we could do is advocate our local government, support our local fair housing organizations to ensure they can do this work. We can also individually volunteer with fair housing organizations to be testers because they need volunteers to do that work. So we can do that and pose as tenants to help tease out where discrimination is happening so that we can stop it. So that's one piece of the voucher program that makes it hard for voucher holders to move to high opportunity areas. Another piece of the program is just the design of the program itself. So the way the Section 8 program works is when you receive a voucher, you pay 30% of your income towards your rent, your monthly income, no matter what it is. And the voucher pays the difference up to a maximum voucher amount or a maximum rental amount. Now, HUD sets that maximum amount based on the full range of rents in a metropolitan area and takes the median or the middle rent, and 10% below that is the maximum voucher amount for the whole metro area. So by definition, 60% of the rents in a metro area are just too expensive for voucher holders to afford. They just can't rent them because they're too expensive. So not surprisingly, many of those 60% are going to be in these higher opportunity, higher cost areas. So it's not surprising that voucher holders can't use their vouchers to leave high poverty neighborhoods because of how the program's designed. Well, there's changes that have been happening to that aspect of the program. In 2010, there was a lawsuit in Dallas about the maximum voucher amount that alleged that it caused the segregation and isolation of voucher holders into segregated communities. And as a result, the housing authorities there they sort of piloted a new way of calculating the maximum voucher amount, which is based on small areas, a zip code or a group of zip codes, rather than the whole metro area. So in higher cost areas of the Dallas region, the voucher would pay more than in lower cost areas, which seems logical and it makes a lot of sense. And as a result of doing that, the voucher holders there had a lot more mobility opportunity. A lot more of them were able to move to higher opportunity areas. So as a result of the success of that program, HUD, after that, started requiring 24 metropolitan areas around the country to use these small area rent standards. Now, as of like 2 days ago, HUD added another 41 metropolitan areas to this group of areas that are required to use the fair market rent, the small area fair market rent standard, and this is one of the new areas added. So, starting at the end of 2024, I think by January 1st, 2025, this region is going to have to use these small area rent standards, which means that voucher holders, it's great. Yeah, so there's now 65 metro areas around the country that have to do this starting in 2025, which is great. And so it's up to us to make sure that our housing authorities are implementing that rule effectively and faithfully. And then up to us also to make sure that voucher holders, now that they have the anti-discrimination ordinance in California, and they're going to have access to higher voucher amounts in this region, will they be able to find landlords who will actually rent to them and not sort of bypass the anti-discrimination ordinances or otherwise try to get out of opening up their units to voucher holders. It will likely still happen, and so it takes organized residents and efforts, all of us, talking to the people we know who are landlords, encouraging them to be involved in the program, and ensuring that this new rule actually has the effect that it's meant to have when it's implemented in about a year. So there's a lot that we can do. And so those are the two main categories and an example from each. And I'll just, so one more example is there's a lot of other strategies we talk about that don't fit neatly into those two categories. A lot of those have to do with opening up home ownership opportunities for African Americans in any type of neighborhood. So what we call race-specific remedies, where the remedy is tied to the person. So we have specific policies that assist African Americans in home ownership in any neighborhood. So instead of tying it to the racial makeup of the neighborhood for eligibility, it's the individual. And this can be down payment assistance programs, subsidies, favorable mortgages, and then also reducing the obstacles that African Americans face uniquely compared to whites in accessing home ownership. And one of those obstacles is the credit scoring system. So the credit scoring system is an example of a program that is racially neutral in its intent. It's a racially neutral policy, but it has a racially discriminatory impact and effect. And here's why. So we think of the credit scoring system as an objective rating of our future likelihood of repaying a debt. It's based on our past financial history, and it's calculated through an algorithm, so it all must be true and fact. But what happens in actuality is it's based on a certain type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. And so, for example, African American neighborhoods of all socioeconomic statuses have fewer bank branches than similar white neighborhoods because banks continue to financially redline these areas and don't have bank branches that offer mortgages, for example, or take deposits in those neighborhoods. So people who live in those neighborhoods have to more often rely on non-traditional financial institutions, like payday lenders, for example. If you get a loan from a payday lender, you have a huge interest rate. Even if you pay that back in full, on time, that doesn't factor into your credit score because credit scores only count traditional financial institutions and traditional credit. Similarly, if you're applying for a mortgage and you have never had a mortgage in the past, you've been a renter your whole life, which African Americans applying for a mortgage are more likely to be first-time home buyers than whites. If you've paid your rent on time your whole life and never missed a rent payment or a utility bill payment, that doesn't benefit you in your credit score because credit scores don't count rental payments or utility bill payments. If you've had a mortgage and you paid it on time, it does count. So this is how it has a racially disparate impact, the credit scoring system, not because African Americans are any less creditworthy, but because of the systems that are set up and how the credit scoring system is designed to count the kinds of financial instruments that whites are more likely to have access to. And so as a result, far more African Americans, I think it's 2/3 of African Americans compared to 1/3 of whites, have no credit score to speak of because they just don't have any of the financial history to feed into a credit score. And of those with a credit score, over half of whites and less than a quarter of African Americans have a credit score high enough to qualify them for a mortgage. So this is sort of not that well-known obstacle to accessing homeownership opportunities for African Americans. And there's a lot that can be done. It's not sort of a problem that can't be solved. The federal government has been talking for 15 years about starting to count rental payment history, and they're starting to pilot some programs now, which is great. But if we wait for that to happen on the federal level, you know, it's been in conversations for 15 years, and the pilot program just started last year, I believe. So we'll be waiting a long time. So in the meantime, we can advocate for change on the local level, which is advocating that our local financial institutions and banks start to adjust their internal credit scoring algorithms to start counting rental payment history. It's a little bit harder for them to do that, but it's not impossible. And several are doing it. Some banks are just not even using credit scores in determining the credit or the eligibility for a mortgage. So there's a lot of ways that local banks can change their practices around this. And they'll do that more likely if there's local pressure to do that. So that's another thing that we can do as groups organize on the local level to make these changes. So those are a few examples, just scratching the surface of what's in our book. We're also continuing to write about these issues in a Substack newsletter at justaction.substack.com because new things keep happening in all of these arenas, and we want to share success stories. We wrote about one that you'll hear about from Margarita soon in that Substack column recently. So you could check it out there and in the book. And basically, what I want to leave you all with before we get to Q&A is that I understand that segregation, our segregated society, it feels like sort of just the way our country is and that there's little we can do to affect it. And I felt that way before starting the project to write this book. But in writing the book and discovering all of the many things that people are doing all over the country to begin to affect change on this in their own communities, I've been left with a lot of hope that there's actually a lot we can do. We don't lack for options, we just need to get started. And it sort of doesn't matter how we start, just that we do something. So I'll leave you with that, and then we'll have some Q&A. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for laying the foundation with history and then laying the path forward with some action items that we can actually move forward on. I'm going to get into the first question. So this is for you, Richard. In your book, you say that newspaper banks and real estate firms have added to the exclusion, have aided in the exclusion. Do you know of any instances where they have paid remedies in any meaningful amount?
Well, there are few of them, but that's because there are very few local action groups that are pressuring this. But I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a curious thing about the Just Action book that we wrote. We featured two community groups, community action groups, that identified local banks that were issuing mortgages to multi-unit landlords, apartment owners, and the mortgages penciled out only if the payment stream that these apartments were going to generate was higher than present rents could support. So the banks were clearly financing gentrification, the eviction of existing tenants in order to raise the rents and recruit higher paying tenants. Well, both of these community groups organized, they conducted demonstrations, they flooded the stockholders' meetings, and they got agreements from the banks to stop lending to multi-unit owners whose mortgage applications predicted higher income streams than they presently had. They got those agreements. They didn't have time to really enforce them, and were having a great difficulty enforcing them before those banks just went out of business. And I have to tell you what those two banks are. And this is my favorite story from the whole book, because it's such an incredible coincidence that we wrote this 2 years before it happened. But the bank in California that we featured, and there's a picture of a demonstration in front of it, was First Republic Bank. Maybe you've heard of it. The bank in New York that we featured, and there's a picture of a demonstration in front of that, was Signature Bank. And that's an example of community groups that actually pressured banks to change their practices. There are some real estate boards around the country, one in California that has confronted its past of being more than a partner, a leader in segregation, and has created its own down payment assistance program targeted to African Americans. We just learned yesterday of the real estate board in Milwaukee that has agreed to do the same thing by having a $50, I think, transfer fee added to the price of a home, the transfer of a home, and that transfer fee is being used to create a fund, hopefully a large one, that will support African American home ownership. So there are examples like that, but we need many more of them.
And I'll just add that the California Association of Realtors Down Payment Assistance Program that is targeted by race for the beneficiaries of that program to redress the harms that the real estate industry caused. It has run out of money, from what I understand. And so this is, the structure of that program exists, and now it's up to us to pressure our local real estate boards and agencies to contribute to that fund to ensure that it continues to operate.
So this second question is for you, Richard, but it's open to both of you. You both are a wealth of information. Outside of the book, is there a way that you can think about archiving what you know and some of the restrictive covenants so that future generations don't forget what we're learning here today?
Well, many communities are doing this. In Just Action, we describe a few of them. Frequently, they assemble large groups of volunteers to identify restrictive covenants in their communities, and they create websites and post them. There is efforts around the country to remove them. Of course, they can't be removed. As Leah said, they're parts of the legal definition of a home. But we think that's a mistaken direction to go. We think the important thing is to advertise them, to show people how their community was segregated so they can learn about the conditions that they have an obligation to remedy. If you remove them and you wipe out any history of how all this happened, the next generation is going to be in worse shape than we are. So the important thing is to advertise them, to archive them, as you say, to put them on a website, to show people. And in Just Action, we describe a group in Charlottesville, Virginia that did this, a group in Modesto, California that did this, and there are many places around the country that are doing that kind of thing.
There's a site, I think it's called Mapping Covenants, that has links to all of the communities that have these kinds of projects, or many of them.
I think it's Mapping Prejudice.
Mapping Prejudice.
We'll figure that out and make sure people know because you registered. So I'm combining the next couple of questions because they're in the same vein. And this is directed towards you, Leah. Any change is hard for everyone. Change is hard. And so especially when we talk about housing, there's a lot of conversation about preservation of the current community, culture, talks about height and density. So how do we do this work while keeping in mind the character? This question included the character of the community. And then another question talked about, because of that fear, a lot of communities are doing historic designations in their communities to push back. And then also they're bringing up one of the tools that they use to fight is the height and density. So what do you say to people who are concerned about those things?
Well, I have a two-pronged answer. One is it's possible to build what's called missing middle housing without changing the aesthetic of a neighborhood. So there are architects and builders and developers that specialize in this, that building housing that is not only single-family homes, but it doesn't look that different from a single family only home neighborhood. So they might be duplexes or triplexes or fourplexes that fit in with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. And that's essential. We need to build that missing middle housing to have housing that's affordable to middle income families who earn too much to qualify for low income housing and too little to afford market rate housing. And this is a great way to do that that doesn't sort of offend the aesthetics of a neighborhood. So that's one practical way. The other answer I have is that, this obligation we're talking about to redress the harms of segregation will involve changing some aspects of our communities. And that's something that we all have to accept, and it's not going to be as bad as people fear. A lot of folks who fight increasing housing density or new multifamily or low-income housing, NIMBYs, not in my backyard, folks who say they support the ideals of affordable housing, but not when it's proposed in their own neighborhood. They often cite the community character as something that will be damaged by multifamily housing, or their own property values will decline. Well, the property value argument has not held up in the evidence. Property values don't decline when new multifamily is built in a neighborhood. And the community character, what is the community character that we care about? Do we want a community character that is inclusive and diverse and open? Then that is what we should be advocating for and defending.
Amen. So the next question is for you, Richard. California is looking into reparations, and do you think that, I don't know how much you know about it, but what you do know about it, do you feel like it is sufficient, or does it have anything that fulfills some of the action that you would like to see people take?
Well, our focus is on remedies because we have an unconstitutional system of segregation. We need specific remedies. What we say in the book is race-specific crimes require race-specific remedies, and the remedies should be targeted to the crimes that were committed. There is a lot of talk in California and elsewhere about reparations. When it comes down to it, though, reparations seems like a very vague and hard to define term. But when it comes down to it, you're talking about specific remedies for specific crimes. Let me give you an example to just build on what Leah was just talking about. I described before the suburbs here and around the country that were created by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration unconstitutionally. Those suburbs weren't for poor people. They were for working families, middle-class families. Remedying that is not going to be done by creating low-income housing in a different neighborhood. And we need to be sure that when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about housing that's affordable for middle-class African Americans as well as for poor people. Most African Americans are not poor. It's a terrible trope we have in this country that people think poor and African American are the same thing. Most African Americans are working families, they have jobs, but they can't afford housing partly because they don't have the same wealth accumulation from prior generations that whites have, and partly because all middle-class families can't afford housing anymore. We have to make sure that when we talk about what Leah talked about is missing middle housing, we're talking about missing middle housing both architecturally and by family income, and not create a situation where we think we're redressing segregation only by creating housing for the poor. We need housing for the poor, but we also need missing middle housing for the middle class.
And I'll add to that, the reparations task force in California has a very long report of their findings and recommendations, and the housing policy recommendations falls into what we call remedies, and overlaps a lot with the recommendations in our book of what we can do on the local level. Enforcing the source of income discrimination law, for example, on the statewide level, again, that protects Section 8 tenants. Getting rid of crime-free housing ordinances that makes it very difficult for anyone with any past criminal involvement, whether they were convicted or not, of accessing housing. So a lot of what we wrote about in Just Action is covered in that reparations task force report and recommendations in the housing policy change recommendations. But it's unlikely that the state will adopt those unless we all are out there supporting them and advocating for them. And we can do that by starting to pass those kinds of actions locally that then the state will start to see that there's support for it and can adopt them on a statewide level. So, yeah.
So Leah, these questions are for you. I'm combining them. They're around the land trust and getting more information. Can you talk a little bit about the requirements that you've seen? Like, is there a certain percentage of income that you need to make or a threshold of income? And then when the homes are sold, is there a lottery system? Because I'm assuming there's a lot of people that want to move in.
That's a good question. So there's over 300 land trusts, or 300 communities with a land trust. Many have more than one. So they're all a little bit different. So I can't answer for all of them. But most of them do have an income qualification range. So it's up to, low income or moderate income households. So there's usually an income cap to be able to qualify for the home. And then, like the example I gave in the Durham Land Trust, where the homes started out as $100,000 and now sell for $150,000, they have to adjust their income threshold a little bit so that families can afford a $150,000 home. So their homes are now selling to households with slightly higher incomes than originally because of how that equation has worked. But there is an eligibility based on income, and I'm not sure, I imagine some might use the lottery system. I'm not sure how they all choose the buyers, but they definitely have to fit in an income qualifying range to afford the home and then to be able to get the benefit of buying the home.
So I know I didn't get to everyone's question. I'm super sorry. We have 1 minute, so this is the last question. So for Richard, when you're speaking, you specifically speak about Black people. Can you talk about why you don't mention other races or cultures?
Sure. Most of the policies that were enacted to create segregation were directed against African Americans. In most of the country, not California, but in most of the country, you go east of the Rocky Mountains, and African Americans were the only people around who were of a non-white minority. So that's who the policies were directed at, and because our focus is so much on how do you remedy specific constitutional violations, we focus on benefits to those who are discriminated against by constitutional violations. Now, when you implement remedies, they're going to benefit a lot of people besides African Americans, because once we have a segregated society with communities with different levels of resources, people are going to sort into them based on their incomes, whether they are African American or not. So you find immigrants who will benefit from the kinds of policies that we described, find Native Americans who are living in urban areas benefiting from those policies as well. But the fundamental crime in the history of this country was the segregation of African Americans. I could go on and on again about this, but let me just say one thing. Of course, when the country was founded, we had slavery. The Constitution acknowledged slavery, didn't abolish it. But in the aftermath of the Civil War, we passed two amendments in particular, the 13th and 14th Amendments, that were the most radically democratic documents in world history, still are, if they'd been obeyed. The Supreme Court annihilated the meaning of the 13th and 14th Amendments. I'm not just talking about the most recent term. I'm talking about since the aftermath of the Civil War. And if those two amendments had been obeyed as they were intended, we would have a racially egalitarian society today. And that should be our ambition. And so in that history, of course, the 13th and 14th Amendments were directed at African Americans. Our country wasn't thinking about other minority groups at that time. Now, California is a bit different. And if the country was like California, of course, there was state-sponsored discrimination against Hispanics in particular, and certainly Native peoples here in California, Asians. But California is a bit different from the rest of the country in that respect. And our book, Leah notwithstanding, our book is not just about California.
All right, so thank you so much for sharing. Can we please get another round of applause for our speakers? Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. So right now I'm going to call our next three speakers up to the stage. And while they're coming up, I am going to ask us all to reflect on what we've just heard. And then I'm going to go off script because that's what I do. I'm going to say that we hear this charge and we want to run out and start work. And this message is particularly for my white community members. When you go out to get the solution for people of color, we have to be part of the solution. And so I see a lot of times that when you go out to fight for us, you come into our spaces and dictate the solution. And even when it has to be self-monitored, because we have been conditioned, everyone has been conditioned to listen to the white voices in the room. So you can't wait for the people of color to tell you, please pause. You have to self-monitor. And so I just want to put that advice out there because as a black woman, as a black leader, I always have to yell and say multiple times to be heard, something that you might need to only say once. So when you go into these spaces, I would ask to start with first listening before you act. That's all. Thank you. Okay, so where are our next wonderful presenters? Are they coming on up? Yeah, come on up. Come on up, take the stage. And while they're taking the stage, we're going to ask that people turn to each other and maybe discuss what you've learned, what you're going to do, next steps, anything interesting while we get them all set up. One moment, please.
Buenas noches. Good evening. I am so happy to be here today. My name is Margarita Mendez, and I am a public school teacher and a member of Menlo Together. Menlo Together is a 5-year-old group of Menlo Park residents and advocates who envision a city that is integrated and diverse, multi-generational, and environmentally sustainable. A city that is welcoming to all. In April 2022, a different group of residents formed to block 90 affordable homes for teachers and staff on an empty former school site in their neighborhood. Their effort resulted in a ballot measure. You might have heard of it, Measure V, that was framed as a zoning ordinance, surprise, but would have a strong regressive racial equity impact, both on housing and education. Let me explain that a bit. The neighborhood seeking to block the new homes is predominantly white, zoned exclusively for single-family homes, and served by a mostly white and affluent Menlo Park City School District. On the other hand, the 90 affordable homes were proposed by the Ravenswood School District. The Ravenswood School District serves communities that were segregated under the color of law and are predominantly Black, brown, immigrant, and working class, low-income families. When Measure B proponents started organizing, their pitch was protect our neighborhoods, protect Menlo Park. That caught my eye. Protect Menlo Park from what? I got involved, I attended meetings, I invited friends, my neighbors to join me, and that's how I connected with Menlo Together. Menlo Together and our partner, Housing Leadership Council, formed a campaign committee to defeat Measure V. We gathered early endorsements, raised funding from housing organizations, community foundations, and local donors. We did polling and developed strategic messaging and a campaign plan. We hired a campaign manager And most significantly, from the start, we had a large, growing, and passionate base of well-connected community leaders who volunteered weekends, weeknights to reversing our history of segregation by defeating Measure V. The campaign was so stressful, because of its importance, but it was also so much fun. A lot of the people here in this room I met because of my work to fight Measure V. On election night, we all gathered at the home of one of Menlo Together's founders, some of us meeting each other for the first time in person, to celebrate our efforts and wait for the preliminary numbers to come in. Early results and the final tally were clear. The people of Menlo Park voted for inclusion and against Measure V 61 to 38%. I'll end by adding that we were determined to use the campaign, win or lose, to build the power for housing justice. In addition to our successes at the ballot box, we built relationships, increased Menlo Together's reputation and membership, and gained new leaders, including 2 No on V volunteers who applied and were appointed to the Menlo Park Planning Commission. Yes, we can, and yes, we did. Thank you.
Good evening, y'all. I see a lot of familiar faces as well, so I'm really excited to be here in amazing company and share with you all a little bit more about the work that we're doing in East Palo Alto around community land trusts. First, my name is Ofelia Bello. I'm a lifelong Bay Area resident, first and foremost, specifically of East Palo Alto, one of many amazing social justice organizers, change makers here in the Bay Area, and also the executive director of a local youth of color-led nonprofit grassroots organization in East Palo Alto called Youth United for Community Action, or YUCA for short. To tell you all a little bit about what YUCA does, YUCA is, like I mentioned, a youth of color-led grassroots nonprofit. We're about 30 years old, and we have, since our inception in 1994, been created, run, and to this day still managed and run by young people of color from low-income backgrounds, and primarily from low-income backgrounds, and from East Palo Alto and the neighboring communities there. We work specifically to create positive systemic change in our communities around social justice and environmental justice issues. Tonight, though, I am here in my capacity as the board chair of our local community land trust in East Palo Alto, known as Pahali CLT, Pahali Community Land Trust. And Pahali, actually, some folks don't know, is both a word in Swahili that means place, and it's also an acronym that stands for Preserving Affordable Housing Assets Long-Term Incorporated. Pretty long, so we say Pahali. And I'm excited to talk to you all a little bit more about what that work has looked like here locally. Leah talked in her talk about CLTs and mentioned that the concept was born, at least within the United States, out of the South, and really crafted by African American folks who were otherwise barred from homeownership and land ownership. Here locally in East Palo Alto, we are creating, I've been involved for the past 5 years and have been fostering and helping grow Pahali Community Land Trust in order to help local change makers afford to be able to stay in the community that we've grown up in and that we are doing organizing work in, so that we can all continue to do the necessary transformative work that will build a more equitable, inclusive community. To remind you all very quickly what the basics are of community land trusts, CLTs acquire, own, and then steward the land for public good. As you all know very well, in our racial capitalist society, what is often asked is, what is the highest profit-making purpose that a piece of land can serve? Within the CLT world, we ask, what is a use that meets the greatest community need, that fits into the community that that piece of land is in? As an example of a CLT that some folks here might be familiar with, there is POST, Peninsula Open Space Trust. And they acquire, own, and steward open space to meet the community's need to connect with nature, to keep a balance between rural and urban land in our region. So that is one sort of parallel, kind of like a CLT that I wanted to mention, since it might help folks kind of draw some parallels between those two. Back to East Palo Alto very briefly. Pahali CLT has its roots in social justice activism and has a mission to ensure that there is no loss of community-owned assets. And that means a few different things that I won't be able to get into too much detail tonight, but excited to share at least the overarching kind of framework of what we do. In other words, what we really aim to do is to prevent community-owned land from being sold to private owners. And the way that I think about it is taking it off the speculative market permanently, in perpetuity. Pahali also facilitates the development of new affordable homes, which in East Palo Alto looks like a lot of development for accessory dwelling units, otherwise known as granny flats or in-law units, because that's what works for our housing landscape in East Palo Alto. We typically do this by buying homes off the open market, placing them under community control, which means a bunch of things that I also can't get into tonight. And then that property remains permanently affordable. What makes Pahali unique is our focus on, like I mentioned a little earlier, housing social justice, local social justice advocates. We often hear about the importance of keeping affordable housing so we can keep folks, essential community members like teachers, paramedics, EMTs, firefighters in our community, and that is critical. I think we all agree with that, right? But in our opinion, it is just as critical to keep local social justice activists housed so that we can continue doing that transformative work necessary that we've been talking about tonight to build a more equitable, inclusive community. Oftentimes that means folks who are doing lower paid work, whether it's nonprofit work or volunteer work, to create the positive systemic change we want to see in our communities. And those folks, again, in our opinion, are just as essential to remaining housed because they are those are the folks who are gonna help us achieve the world that we're dreaming of here with you all tonight. In conclusion, I highly encourage folks to visit California Community Land Trust Network. I think you can just Google it. I'm not going to remember the website right off the top of mind, but California Community Land Trust Network will take you to a landing page that will show you all of the California Community Land Trusts that are participating in the statewide network and our partners that include Indigenous community land trusts and Indigenous folks throughout our region, because it's just as important to make sure that we are stewarding in good faith partnership with the folks who have been stewarding this land for thousands of years. And I will conclude there. Thank you.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? Okay. My name is Nancy Nagel. I live in San Carlos, and I'm leader in Faith in Action Bay Area. Faith in Action is a network of over 100 congregations and schools in San Francisco and San Mateo counties. We are multiracial, multilingual, intergenerational, multi-faith, and cross-class. Our purpose is to develop community leaders who build power to change unjust systems, and we are led by our members who are most affected by injustice, including immigrant families, low-income people, and seniors. We have teams in San Francisco and several jurisdictions in San Mateo County, each of which focuses on achieving outcomes that their impacted members identify as solutions that they need for their housing instability. I work with the team in Redwood City, where immigrant community leaders have worked for years to address the inequitable impacts of the housing crisis. Over 2 years ago, they held a series of focus groups with Redwood City residents. And based on the learnings in those groups, plus based on their own experience, they identified 3 policies to propose to the City Council. City Council has since adopted 1 of these 3 policy proposals, and we will be continuing to push for the other 2. Our Redwood City group consists of a team of Spanish-speaking leaders and a team of English-speaking leaders. The Spanish speakers are more heavily impacted by housing injustice, so they identify the solutions to advocate for and the strategies to get there. The English-speaking team, which I belong to, supports them by attending their actions and lending our voices and our presence to strengthen theirs. In doing so, in city council and county board meetings, I have often observed a wall of skepticism and resistance to even acknowledging that these problems are real, despite the fact that the immigrant families provide in those very same meetings detailed accounts of the horrendous conditions they are facing. I find this frustrating, but I also wonder how much of the disbelief is because the concerns of low-income people of color just don't feel as real to the elected leaders. Or maybe because it's the mountains of money that our opponents throw into this. Lobbying groups like the California Apartment Association, the California Association of Realtors, they invest many millions statewide in campaigns to ensure that the status quo remains and that their members can retain the profits that they enjoy. And those contributions buy loyalty, at least in the short run. Our next big action is to get, I don't want to lose that, is to get the County Board of Supervisors to pass a Tenant Protection Ordinance, or TPO, or TPO for short, that will be voted on in early November. We are working on this in collaboration with a large number of other community groups, several of whom are represented here tonight. And the TPO would close loopholes in existing state law to help prevent unjust evictions for renters living in the unincorporated areas of San Mateo County. It would help keep the families who are complying with their leases in their homes and bring them the security they deserve. It would also serve as a model for other jurisdictions in the state. If you're interested in learning more about the work of Faith in Action, please let us know. The stronger our team becomes, the more power we can bring to the table to demand change. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I get another round of applause for these powerful? You just heard 3 examples of work being done locally. We had to choose from many different examples, and I'm very glad that we lifted these 3 up. In all, there were 17 organizations who came together to make a reality of this event, and still they account for only a piece of the overall work being done here in San Mateo County. For the most part, these organizations focus in their individual jurisdictions, but there are moments when we can all come together to advocate for a policy that's important to all of us. The Tenant Protection Ordinance, or TPO, that Nancy mentioned is one of those such instances. All of our organizations are pulling together to put this and to make sure that this ordinance gets passed. Soon, you will learn how you can give your support to this. To conclude our program, I would like to invite one of my favorite people that I don't get to see that much, but I learned and met her during the COVID-19 crisis. That is still happening. And her work together, we lifted up our community who was in such dire need because of housing insecurity. If we had secure, stable housing for our community, many of our members wouldn't have been affected the way they were. Housing affects us in so many ways. So I would like to invite up to the podium Reverend Dr. Marlon Bussey, co-director of the Peninsula Solidarity Cohort and pastor of St. James AME Zion Church in the North Central neighborhood of San Mateo. St. James AME Zion Church was the first African-American church in the county and the first meeting place in San Mateo for the NAACP. It was founded in 1919, and Reverend Bussey became its first female pastor in 2009. Reverend.
Thank you. Wow. A pulpit, a microphone, and a full house. How much time y'all have? Just kidding. When Mr. Rothstein came to the Peninsula Solidarity Cohort several years ago now, I had just finished reading The Color of Law. I had the pleasure of being his Uber driver from the Millbrae BART station to our meeting. And I shared with him how absolutely on target his book was and how it resonated with my lived experience in San Francisco. The book laid out the issues with precision. Thank you for giving us solutions through your new book, Just Action. There are few things more powerful than story, real-life accounts of someone's experience to help people understand what certain segments of the community endure. So I'm going to share one briefly this evening. Some of you know that I was a high school counselor, retiring after 25 years of service at Sequoia High School in Redwood City. I worked with many kids who were homeless or experiencing housing insecurity. There was one young man, who I will call Joe, not his real name. He came to see me one day needing some help. As it turns out, this young man was 18, entering his senior year, when his parents decided they could no longer afford to be here any longer and abruptly went back to Mexico. There he was, with nowhere to live and no means to support himself. He got a full-time job at a movie theater working until midnight, and he lived in the garage of someone's home. A garage with no heat, no electricity, no bathroom, no bed, and the occasional rat. He slept on a pallet on the floor, he washed up in the bathroom at his job, and he ate wherever he could. He came to me for none of those reasons that day, but because he needed me to advocate for him to get more time to get a major assignment submitted. When I heard all of this, I wanted to talk to his landlord to see what could be done, but he begged me not to, because he said the man told me if I didn't like the garage, to leave, and he would gladly rent it to someone else. So Joe put up with all of that until he graduated that June, and I can only pray that life got better for him after that. What does Joe's story have to do with tenant protections? From the lens through which I view the world, everything. Because tenant protection is about leveling the playing field between those in need of housing and those who own the housing that's needed. It's about allowing people to secure safe, affordable housing and protecting them from undue harassment and unprovoked and unwarranted eviction. It's about giving everyone who lives in this county an equal chance for a good life. So then, we could ask, what can we do? But rather than ask that question, let's ask the better question. What will you do? The weight of this history is upon us. Its impacts are everywhere in evidence. The injustices are deeply felt. You have heard many ideas, and you have learned that there are many organizations actively at work to promote racial and economic justice in this county. Where and what will be your contribution? The responsibility is on each of us. There is one concrete action we can all take to follow up tonight's event. The Rothsteins have reminded us of the importance of tenant protections in creating a just community. We want to invite you, in fact, we want to encourage you to sign a petition in support of the Tenant Protection Ordinance that comes before the County Board of Supervisors on November 7th. Passage of this ordinance is an important step toward building a community that is inclusive, diverse, and just. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Busty. As for the petition she mentioned, you can sign it in the community hall, or you can sign it electronically. We have a QR code and a link that will be posted in the foyer, in the breezeway, and in the community hall. And so I hope that you all sign it, and then I challenge you to find 5 more other people to sign it. As we wrap up our event, I want to thank the Congregational Church of San Mateo for allowing us to gather in this evening in this beautiful venue. This is my first time here, and it's gorgeous. I'd also like to thank all the event sponsors who have demonstrated the power of deep collaboration in bringing to life the various aspects of this event tonight. A special shout out to Faith in Action for their, for their strong organizational support it has provided to this event. And of course, a final thanks to our speakers, the Rothsteins, for their groundbreaking and inspiring work.